The palace was buzzing, the cameras flashing, but William stood frozen, silent, unreadable. Behind the scenes, something had shattered. And as whispers rippled through royal halls, only one phrase echoed in every corridor: "This changes everything." What William just learned would alter his path and the monarchy forever. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It began with a private briefing in one of Kensington's most restricted rooms, an unexpected summons for William. No aides, no cameras, just a thick envelope and a guarded silence. By the time he emerged, his world had changed. His stride was slower, his expression visibly drained. The man known for calm control and polished poise had been hit with something more personal than political. At a royal engagement later that afternoon, sharp-eyed observers noticed something rare: William, distracted, distant, barely registering the moment. But it was Catherine's hand, firmly clutching his in front of dozens of photographers, that gave away the weight of what had happened. Their body language, usually discreet and reserved, now told a different story. Something inside the palace had shaken them both to their core. Within hours, the speculation exploded. Was it a health crisis? A betrayal? A death in the inner circle? Royal correspondents scrambled for answers, while Kensington Palace issued a carefully worded statement offering no comment on the Prince of Wales's internal briefings. But it wasn't denial, it was deflection. And inside royal walls, aides were already whispering that what William had learned was no ordinary scandal. According to two unnamed sources close to the crown, it was an emotional shock, one tied not to politics, but to the very foundations of William's trust. The kind of revelation that leaves not just a man, but a future king questioning everything he thought he understood about his role, his legacy, and the people closest to him. The palace staff was split, some scrambling to contain the story, others shaken by William's uncharacteristic silence. It was clear this wasn't a momentary stumble. This was a rupture. Catherine, ever composed, never left his side. For the first time in years, she cancelled appearances without explanation. Their united front only fueled public intrigue. If the future queen looked that concerned, people reasoned, then the situation must be more serious than anyone was letting on. And yet, no one truly knew what William had discovered, only that it had sent shockwaves through the palace, that his father had refused to speak on it, and that the monarchy's equilibrium had been thrown into quiet chaos. The silence from Buckingham was deafening and deliberate, because the truth wasn't just painful. But to understand the gravity of what William faced, we must go back to the one secret he believed would never surface. For years, it had been buried, sealed in silence, locked away under layers of royal protection. But secrets, no matter how deep, have a way of clawing back into daylight. And this one? It's personal, painful, and explosive. The document was first drafted in the aftermath of unimaginable grief, a legal addendum meant to protect a grieving family and secure the legacy of a woman who had become more than just a royal figure. It had been signed, sealed, and hidden within the royal archives under the strictest of classifications. Few even knew it existed. Fewer still had read it. But within its clauses lay a devastating truth. A decision made without William's knowledge, one that fundamentally altered the balance of inheritance, responsibility, and influence tied to Princess Diana's estate, and most crucially, William's role within the future of the monarchy. For over a decade, it sat untouched, unseen, held back under the guise of unity. But now, it had resurfaced, and the weight of its revelations threatened to rupture the very foundation of everything William believed he stood for. It was a whistleblower, an anonymous former royal archivist, who finally brought it forward. Motivated not by malice, but by a sense of unfinished justice, they leaked a portion of the document to a private legal firm, knowing it would force the palace to respond. The content was staggering. It revealed that at a pivotal moment, just years after Diana's passing, a decision had been made by senior royal figures to divert certain rights and privileges originally designated for William. These were not ceremonial titles or trivial gestures. They were matters of legal consequence. financial control over portions of the Spencer family trust, advisory privileges over certain charitable institutions founded by Diana, and symbolic custodianship of legacy initiatives that had long been assumed to fall to him by birthright. William, it seemed, had been cut out not entirely, but enough to raise serious questions. The most shocking revelation? That Charles himself had authorized the directive, citing the emotional volatility of the moment and the greater need for stability. In the short term, it was buried. Long term, it created a fracture that could no longer be ignored. William had grown into his role, taken on responsibilities with the belief that he was honoring his mother's vision. But the document now exposed that much of that vision had been quietly redirected, controlled by others who had shaped it to serve the palace's political convenience, not personal truth. The betrayal wasn't just institutional, it was deeply human. Inside the palace, silence hardened into tension. He was questioning the very fabric of his upbringing, who had protected him and who had merely managed him. The monarchy's image of unity had come at a price. And now, for the first time, he was seeing just how high that price truly was. But William wasn't the only one affected, because what the document hinted at implicated someone even closer to him. Behind her poised smile and regal presence, Catherine had been carrying a burden, one that William never fully understood until now. And when he learned the truth, it didn't just break his heart, it made him question everything. For months, Catherine had known. The sealed document, the details surrounding Diana's estate, the quiet decision made behind William's back, she had been made aware in confidence, not as a wife, but as a future queen. Aides had come to her first, fearing what the revelation might do to the man they both served and loved. They had urged her to stay silent, to wait, to shield William from the storm gathering just beyond his line of sight. And Catherine, torn between truth and protection, chose what she believed was mercy. And now, as William pieced together the betrayal not just of legacy, but of trust, he turned inward, wounded not by her intentions, but by her suffering in solitude. Sources closest to the couple confirmed what had long been suspected behind palace walls. She had faced the moral weight of deception, knowing that revealing the truth too soon could destroy not only William's image of his family, but destabilize the entire monarchy. She hadn't withheld the truth out of malice. She had done it out of love. But love, in the palace, is rarely simple. And when duty clashes with intimacy, something always fractures. William's reaction was not anger, not at first. It was sorrow, deep, shaking sorrow. For all the times she smiled at him, knowing what he didn't. For all the nights she sat silently beside him as he spoke of legacy, future, and his mother's memory, unaware that she already knew what had been taken from him. It wasn't betrayal of trust. It was the realization that Catherine had been forced to bear a pain that should have been his to carry. And that guilt cut him in ways no headline ever could. Privately, the tension between them was sharp. Conversations grew longer, pauses stretched wider. Yet despite it all, they remained united in public, refusing to give the press even a glimpse of the crack. Their hands still touched, their smiles still flickered. But behind those gestures lived an unspoken ache, one that both of them knew would not fade quickly. And yet, there was something else beneath it to resolve. Because now, the truth was no longer hidden, and William was no longer blind. But inside the palace, truth is rarely left to stand on its own. Already, another figure was preparing to seize control of the narrative, to reshape perception before it spiraled beyond recovery. And this time, the battlefield would not be legal or emotional, but political. As the storm swirled within the palace, one figure emerged from the shadows, determined to control the narrative before it consumed them all. For a king known for patience, Charles moved with shocking speed. Within hours of the leak, he summoned his advisors and initiated a private council. His goal? Containment. But what he didn't expect was rebellion. The atmosphere in the private council chamber was tense. The leaked document had torn through the palace like a blade, and Charles knew that if he didn't get ahead of the narrative, the monarchy could face a crisis not seen since the 1990 seconds. The king opened the meeting with calm authority, but those closest to him could see the strain beneath the surface. He proposed a swift and measured response, an official statement questioning the authenticity of the document, painting it as an outdated, non-binding draft never meant for public scrutiny. It was a classic palace maneuver: control the narrative by blurring the facts. But this time, the tactic would not work, because this time, William was in the room. For the first time in decades, a sitting monarch and his direct heir found themselves on opposite sides of a table, emotionally charged, politically divided, and unwilling to back down. William, still reeling from the betrayal and Catherine's months of silent suffering, refused to go along with the plan. He argued not just as a son, but as a man who had been misled for years. His voice didn't rise, but his words struck like thunder. He demanded the palace acknowledge the truth, to stop shielding the past behind protocol. Charles, blindsided by the defiance, reminded his son of what was at stake: the crown's image, public stability, the centuries-old institution they both represented. But William didn't flinch, because for him, the cost of silence had already been paid in blood and trust. The rift didn't stop there. Princess Anne, ever the realist, backed William's position. She argued that the monarchy had evolved, and denying what the public already suspected would only deepen the damage. Prince Edward, more cautious, urged Charles to stay the course and avoid emotional decisions. The room fractured, loyalties blurred. What had begun as a strategy meeting spiraled into an ideological standoff. It was no longer about a document. It was about the soul of the monarchy, whether it would be built on truth or preserved by suppression. Camilla, always close to the king's side in times of tension, reportedly urged him to issue a firm rebuke not just of the leak, but of the narrative surrounding it. She feared the institution was slipping into chaos, and believed the monarchy needed to reassert its authority. But the whispers inside the palace walls told a different story. Staffers said they hadn't seen this level of internal division since Diana's death, that the emotional wounds, long buried under royal decorum, had finally ruptured into the light, and the damage could no longer be managed behind closed doors. Because outside, the world had moved on. Social media had erupted, headlines had taken sides, and for the first time in generations, the public wasn't waiting for a royal statement to decide where their loyalty stood. But the world outside the gates had already picked a side, and it wasn't the crown's. For once, the public didn't wait for an official statement. They saw William's pain, and they responded not with criticism, but with solidarity. The narrative was no longer about scandal, it was about loyalty. In a monarchy that has so often relied on silence, tradition, and carefully worded statements, it was the people who spoke first, and they spoke loudly. Within hours of William's confrontation with the crown, social media exploded with support. Images of him standing beside Catherine, haunted eyes, clenched jaw, but unbroken, spread across every platform. The hashtags told the story the palace wouldn't. Number We Stand With William, number Justice for Diana, number Truth Over Tradition. This wasn't just public sympathy. It was a reckoning. For the first time in years, the royal family's most controlled narrative was slipping beyond their grasp, and it was slipping into the hands of a generation that had long questioned the shadows behind the throne. Public figures, celebrities, journalists, even political voices began weighing in. Some called for complete transparency regarding Diana's estate. Others demanded an independent review of royal finances and archival practices. But beneath every call for clarity was a deeper sentiment. William had been wronged, not just by history, but by the very institution he was destined to lead. And people saw themselves in his struggle betrayed by tradition, held hostage by silence, yet still standing with dignity. The pressure began to mount not just on social platforms, but within government. In Parliament, murmurs of concern grew louder. A select committee began raising questions about the legal status of the sealed documents. Was it constitutional for such significant decisions, especially those involving Diana's legacy and public trust, to be concealed from the heir to the throne? Was the palace, once again, operating in the shadows of accountability? Political factions that had previously avoided royal commentary suddenly found themselves pulled into the debate, and some weren't afraid to admit it. If the monarchy wanted to maintain public support, it would have to evolve or risk breaking. Approval ratings reflected the shift in real time. William and Catherine saw a historic surge in public favour, eclipsing even the heights reached during their wedding and early tours. Meanwhile, Charles, stoic, measured, and increasingly silent, saw a sharp decline. His refusal to address the controversy had once been viewed as royal restraint. Now, it felt like royal indifference. The people weren't asking for spectacle. They were asking for honesty, and they had already chosen who they believed embodied that honesty. But inside the palace, behind walls that had seen centuries of succession battles and scandals, one figure was preparing to do what no heir had done in living memory. He had watched the storm rage. He had seen the silence weaponized, and now, backed by the voice of the people, William was about to make the most dangerous move of his royal life, one that would not only redefine his relationship with the crown, but with his own father. But in the heart of the storm, William makes a move no one expected, one that would put him at odds with his father forever. He stepped forward not as a prince, but as a man unwilling to be silent any longer. William didn't just speak. He defied the royal script, and in doing so, shattered decades of carefully controlled tradition. When the statement was released, there was no elaborate preamble, no ceremonial language, no palace filters. It was direct, deeply personal, and devastating in its honesty. William acknowledged the existence of the hidden document. He spoke of the pain of discovering a truth long concealed, of the quiet years spent honoring a legacy that had been redirected without his knowledge. And then came the words that sent shockwaves through every level of the establishment. He called for accountability within the monarchy, not reform in some distant future, not reflection, accountability. Now, inside palace walls, Charles was reportedly blindsided. The timing, the tone, the refusal to soften the message. This was not the carefully negotiated response the king had been preparing. This was his son stepping outside the framework of royal obedience and speaking directly to the people. And beside him, in absolute silence, stood Catherine. No interruption, no correction, just presence. Her stillness spoke volumes. It confirmed that this was not an impulsive act, but a united stand. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Support poured in from every corner of the country. Veterans of the press, former diplomats, cultural figures, and millions of ordinary citizens praised William's courage. Many called it the most honest royal address in generations. Others said it marked the true beginning of a new monarchy, but within the institution, the mood was far more dangerous. Advisors whispered of constitutional consequences. Traditionalists warned of destabilization. Some privately suggested the heir had gone too far, too fast. But William did not retreat. He did not amend his words. He did not apologize. For the first time in living memory, the monarchy was no longer defined by restraint. It was defined by resolve. William had crossed a line no royal heir had ever crossed. And in doing so, he had forced every corner of the crown to choose a side truth or tradition, transparency or silence, future or past. The fracture was no longer hidden. It was now public, undeniable, and irreversible. And just when it seemed the monarchy couldn't fracture any further, another voice emerged from the past to complicate everything. Out of the silence came a voice no one expected. A former royal aide, long thought irrelevant, now held the missing pieces to a puzzle decades in the making, and their revelations would ignite the final fire. The letters arrived not through the palace, not through the press, but through a carefully timed leak to an international media outlet. The former aide had served Princess Diana in her final years and had kept, in secret, a collection of private correspondence' handwritten letters never meant to see the light of day. But now, decades later, they were all that remained to defend the truth. In them, Diana wrote plainly. She expressed fears of erasure, worries that her legacy, her sons, her values, her voice, would be buried by the very institution that once silenced her. And more pointedly, she made clear her desire for William to one day carry forward not just the crown but her spirit. The content of those letters validated everything William had just risked his future to say. His public defiance no longer seemed reckless, it felt prophetic. But the implications didn't stop there. One letter in particular outlined Diana's wish that certain truths be preserved, truths that had allegedly been sealed away by Charles's inner circle. The document William had exposed. According to the aide, it had been buried with full knowledge of its importance, suppressed not by accident, but by design. The media reaction was explosive. Broadcasters halted scheduled programming. Commentators scrambled to update timelines. And across social platforms, theories once dismissed as tabloid fodder surged into mainstream dialogue. Old footage of Diana resurfaced, her famous interviews, her warnings, her subtle glances suddenly took on new meaning. For the public, it wasn't just a twist in the story, it was vindication. Everything they'd suspected, everything they'd whispered about for years, confirmed. Behind the scenes, palace legal teams moved quickly. Cease and desist letters, urgent consultations, contingency plans. But none of it could outpace the wave that had already been unleashed. And what stunned insiders most wasn't just the content of the letters, it was who began to break ranks, advisors to the late Queen. Former courtiers who had remained silent for decades began contradicting Charles's narrative, some carefully, others boldly, but all with the same undercurrent. Something had gone terribly wrong at the highest levels of power, and in the midst of this chaos, William broke, privately, silently. For days, he had been carrying the weight of loyalty and betrayal, of legacy and exposure. But this was something deeper, something ancestral. His mother's voice had returned, not as a whisper in his memory, but as a written record of love, warning, and trust. And now he saw it all clearly. The scale of what had been hidden, the cost of what he'd been asked to endure, and the impossible task of holding the institution together while it pulled him apart. But as William reeled from the past, it was Catherine who made the ultimate decision, one that would define their future. She had been the quiet strength behind the throne, but now, Catherine stepped into the spotlight not to defend but to lead, and her next move would silence even the most loyal defenders of the old regime. In the wake of explosive revelations, with the monarchy teetering between reform and collapse, it was Catherine who moved swiftly, not with fury, but with resolve. She reached out not to courtiers or spin doctors, but to women she knew carried the weight of history differently. Princess Anne, sharp and unflinching, Sophie, dignified yet overlooked, and Lady Louise, young but fiercely aware of what legacy means in a crumbling system. The meeting was held in private, and yet within hours, whispers had already escaped the walls. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a reckoning. Catherine laid out a vision that stunned even Anne. It was bold, unapologetic, and clear. The monarchy had lost the people's trust, not because it was too old, but because it had refused to grow. She proposed a new framework, one centered not around silence and secrecy, but transparency and shared duty. No more hidden archives, no more unsigned documents, no more shadow games played behind palace curtains. Succession itself, she argued, should no longer be a whisper in corridors. It should be an open promise to the people. What began as a discussion turned into something more. Anne, long the quiet enforcer of protocol, gave her full support. Sophie, often dismissed as a background royal, called the proposal Diana's legacy fulfilled. And Lady Louise, whose mother had once protected the institution at great personal cost, pledged herself to the new vision without hesitation. In less than 48 hours, the palace issued a single-line announcement that stunned the world. A joint summit hosted by the Prince and Princess of Wales would be held broadcast globally. It would be the first of its kind. No sovereign present, no Camilla, no Charles, just William and Catherine, stepping into the storm and owning it. When the moment arrived, it was unlike anything the monarchy had ever staged. Not a celebration, Not a coronation, an unveiling, a vision of what comes next. Catherine spoke with clarity and compassion, addressing not just Britain, but the world. William followed, not as a man torn between loyalties, but as a partner ready to rebuild something new. Together, they presented a royal family reborn, not in tradition alone, but in truth. And though the shadows of betrayal still loomed, something had shifted. The silence had broken. The people were watching, and this time, they saw something worth believing in again. And so, as the institution remade itself, one final message echoed across the kingdom, proof that from heartbreak can rise something stronger. There was no parade, no golden orb, no official crown. But make no mistake, something had been handed over. Not just power, but trust. And in the eyes of millions, that's all that ever mattered. The whispers started small. A few tabloids, a morning talk show here and there. But then, it was everywhere. The people's sovereigns. Not a name granted by decree but earned. William and Catherine had become more than just heirs. They had become symbols of something the monarchy hadn't seen in decades. Humility, clarity, and conviction. After generations of veiled decisions and silent obedience, the public finally saw a royal couple who didn't just serve, they stood. And in doing so, they ignited a movement. Parliament, long hesitant to meddle with royal tradition, moved swiftly. A reform bill was introduced, redefining the roles of future monarchs. It outlined clearer succession rights, increased public transparency, and, for the first time, granted heirs the ability to formally co-govern, select national initiatives. The bill wasn't just political, it was historic. It marked a shift from figureheads to participants, from passive titles to active purpose, and behind every clause, behind every line of text, stood the quiet force of Catherine and the steady hand of William. But the changes weren't confined to legislation. Even the monarchy's ancient symbols began to shift. The royal crest, untouched for generations, was revised. For the first time, a new insignia was delicately etched into the design, an emblem representing Catherine's lineage and her modern influence. A subtle change, yes, but the message was thunderous. This was no longer a reign shaped by silence and shadows. It was shaped by presence, by choice, by courage. In a statement that echoed across continents, William addressed the nation once again. But this time, there was no pain in his voice, only clarity. Let this be a crown shaped by truth, not silence. One that honors its past but serves its people. That listens. That changes. Those words didn't just resonate, they redefined what the crown could mean in the 21st century. As the world watched this transformation unfold, Charles quietly stepped back. No scandal, no grand farewell. Just a carefully worded announcement. In light of my health and new priorities, I will no longer serve in an active capacity. With that, the transition was complete, not with thunder, but with grace. And though some loyalists clung to the old ways, most accepted what had always been inevitable. The torch had been passed. The final moment of the documentary isn't filled with spectacle, it's filled with words. William's words. From pain, we found purpose. And in that single sentence, decades of struggle, silence, and sorrow were reshaped into strength. Because in the end, it wasn't the crown that defined William. It was how he rose when everything tried to break him. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.